Hi, um, my name is Pete. I'm a game designer, a game programmer and game designer. I started out making games when I was around y'all's age, and I did it as a hobby for years. I had a whole other career as a writer because I didn't make any money off of games and I was just doing it for fun. But I made and released a bunch of games for fun and started to get a little bit of audience from those. And after a while, I was able to use those games to get myself a job at a real game studio. So I'm going to be talking about game development today, but I know that this is a sort of a general programming group, and I think what I'm going to be talking about will have some application to stuff, even if you're not working on games. But if you are working on games, hopefully you're in for a treat. So, have any of you ever heard of the game Cuphead?
Yeah.
Okay, we got a yeah. And have you played Cuphead?
Yeah.
Got a few yeah. Has anybody beaten Cuphead? It's pretty quiet in here. Yeah, Cuphead's pretty tough. But I work at StudioMDHR, which is the company that made Cuphead. And if you're not familiar with Cuphead, it's a run and gun platform game that uses all hand-drawn art in a 1930s style. So it kind of looks like the very oldest Disney cartoons. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the game here. So all of this, everything that you're seeing was drawn on paper with pencils. It was inked with pens. It was scanned into the computer and programmed into the game. So that's what makes it really look different from other games out there. So today I'm going to show you a little bit about how we polished up a single object in this game. So everything that you see that's not part of the background, Cuphead running around, the coins, the enemies, those are all objects. I'm going to show you the details of how we made just one of them. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on the programming part because I know everybody might be at sort of different levels of experience with programming. But if you are a bit of a more advanced programmer, as I show you how we worked through the part of the game I'm going to show you, maybe think about how you would do the things that I'm showing you in your own projects. And if you have any specific questions about that, I'm glad to go into it more when it's Q&A time at the end. So the Cuphead DLC, the downloadable expansion for Cuphead, has a level called Doggone Dogfight. And the idea for this level is you're riding on the wings of this old-fashioned plane while you fight a bunch of dogs who are flying big fighter planes and attack helicopters and stuff. And the design for the plane that you ride on works like this. The plane stays at the same place on the screen vertically, so up and down, doesn't move up and down, but you can steer it horizontally, left and right, based on where you're standing on the wings of the plane. So if you stand all the way to the left, your weight pushes the wing down and the plane steers in that direction. So the first thing that we did, we got the simplest version of that idea running in the game. And here's what that looked like. So you can see everything I described is in there. Doesn't really look like a finished game yet. Just a red line that's sliding back and forth, but it does do what it's supposed to do, which is, your where you are on the plane changes which direction it goes. You might be wondering why the enemy's plane is a line with a guy with a beard in the middle. The guy with the beard is my boss, Jared. We used his face all over the game when we didn't have any actual art yet. And that's how game features usually start, with big white boxes and silly temporary art. And one thing that I think is important when you're making a game or anything is not to get too discouraged at the beginning if something looks or feels kind of broken or silly. It always looks that way when you start. The trick is really the trick to making something cool is really just to start simple, get the basics in there, and keep working on the details one little step at a time. So that's what I'm going to show you here is how we took this plane from this very basic prototype to something in the finished game. So what's something that we need to fix here? Probably the most obvious thing. We need some actual art, right? So the next step was to get at least a test image in there. And even though, I mean, like I just said, it's fine to use temporary art to rough things out, it can definitely be helpful to get actual art in there early so that you can see how it feels and see how it changes things. You know, sometimes a game can feel pretty different with real art in there instead of test art. And things that might be really obvious with test art and easy to play might actually be kind of hard to see when there's real art in there. Or, you know, the actual art could be much too small when you put it in, or too big, or it could blend into the background and get lost. So the next thing we did, just to make sure we were on the right track, was we put in some art for the plane. And that's what this looked like. So it's just a little test. And by the way, in a 2D game, art like this is called a sprite. So a sprite in a 2D game is anything that moves around the screen. 2D games are all backgrounds and sprites. So as you can see, there's no actual animation yet. It's just a single picture that's moving back and forth at this point. But it already felt a little bit closer to where we were going. Now, in a 2D game, there's no 3D, right? So everything that you see on the screen is a flat piece of 2D art. And you can imagine it like you're cutting pictures out of a magazine and pasting them onto a flat piece of cardboard. It's like all you have is this flat piece of cardboard. There's no depth like in a 3D game. You know, we can't turn the camera around, right? But I want you to look at the background in this next scene from Cuphead. And what is happening here, right? And I'll go ahead and I can show you the background here by itself. So that background looks kind of 3D, right? It looks like there's depth to it. But it's actually all 2D layers. And I'll show you the layers here. My friend Caitlin painted all these. So it's watercolor on paper. So what's happening in that scene is the layers that we want to make them look farther away. Those ones are moving slower than the layers that we want to have look closer. Kind of like, you know, I always remember when I was a kid, you're driving around in the car. It's like, why is the moon following us? Because it's so far away. So it doesn't seem like it's moving, right? So it's the same thing here. Does anybody know what that effect is called?
Parallax.
Parallax. All right, somebody got it. Okay, so yes, it's called parallax. If you want to know more about it, you can look up parallax scrolling. And by the way, if you don't know what something's called, it doesn't mean that you're not smart enough to understand it. You know, the name doesn't really matter. It just helps you look it up. So you just learn things as you go. But this is called parallax. You might not notice it that much while you're playing the game, especially because this game is so hard that you have to really concentrate on what's going on. But let's take a look at it again here. So keep this in your head. And then let's see what the level would look like if we didn't use parallax. It's much more flat, right? So almost every 2D game out now uses parallax somewhere or other. And here's another, this is another really famous example. You might know this game. And this is, you know, you can just see all these beautiful looking layers here. But But as you can see, parallax is usually used for backgrounds. I just showed you 2 examples of parallax in backgrounds. But we were looking at our plane flying back and forth in the dogfight level, and we thought, okay, we've got the sprite of the plane. What if we used a little bit of parallax on the sprite itself? Could we make the plane look a little bit more like a real 3D object while
for the
keeping...
transfer that you type?
Oh, sorry, I could hear somebody else. Okay, so keep the plane looking a little bit more like a 3D object while keeping the hand-drawn look that Cuphead is known for. We don't want to use 3D graphics. We want everything to be drawn on paper. So that's what we did here. And I'm going to show you what I mean. First, we broke the plane up into pieces. Okay, and these are the pieces that make up the plane. And then, just like we did with that sort of Wild West background I just showed you, we take our plane code and we have the pieces of the plane that are closest to the screen, or that are supposed to look closest to the screen, move faster. And we have the pieces that are farthest from the screen move slower. So let's see what that looks like. So I don't know, I'm not sure how well video is coming through, but maybe that gives you a sense. You can see that as the plane moves back and forth, there's a little bit of a sense that it's in a 3D space. So pretty cool, right? Can you think about maybe how you would do something like that in one of your projects? Next time you're working on something in 2D, you could think about how to do something like that. So this is looking more interesting than it was, but it still looks pretty stiff, right? It's not that exciting to look at. It's not actually animated at all, for one thing. So one thing that we did in Cuphead that most games don't do, actually, even most 2D games, is even when a character is standing completely still, or when you have something that normally wouldn't be, something rigid or made out of metal, like a plane, we drew 2 or 3 different versions of that drawing, even if it's exactly the same shapes. But in animation, each drawing is called a frame. The artist draws a frame in pencil, and then a second artist called the inker traces over that frame in ink. And for Cuphead, on frames where characters are standing still or objects wouldn't normally be moving, the inkers traced over the frame 3 separate times, and we play those frames in a loop. And I'm going to show you the difference that makes here. Let's see. Right. So the versions of Cuphead and Mugman that you see on the left feel much more alive, right? It's like they're living things in the scene. They don't just feel like they're painted in there like the ones on the right. In animation, this is called a boil because it kind of looks like the lines are boiling like a pot of water, but it's just from tracing the same picture 3 times. Just gives it a little extra life. So when we go back to the plane, let's add a few new drawings of boil on the plane that we got from the animation team, okay? I'm just looking at the plane here. It's not just a boil. You can see the propellers moving now, the wheels are spinning, but the wings are pretty much just boiling. And it makes it feel a lot more alive, right? It gives it a lot more life. So we're almost there, but there are a few more things to do. And they're kind of subtle. The closer you get, the more you have to dig to find stuff. But if we take a close look at what the plane looks like now, there are a couple things that bother me here. And a big part of game development or any creative project is just kind of seeing things that bother you and being bothered by them until you figure out how to fix them. So the 2 things that bother me here, I'm going to play the video again, and I want you to look at what happens specifically when the character jumps from one side of the plane to the other. Right there. So the angle of the plane just snaps to where you land, right? There's no smooth transition at all. It's just anywhere you are, anywhere you jump to on the plane instantly snaps to that position. It looks a little bit disconnected. The other thing, I'll play it again, the plane doesn't really feel like it's in the air. It just sort of feels like it's like it's got a motor and it's moving back and forth. It always stays in the exact same position on the screen vertically. There's no up and down movement at all. And it kind of feels like you're running around on the wings of this tiny plane and you're affecting it with your weight. Kind of feels like when the player jumps and lands on the plane should move up and down a little bit, right? So we'll talk about the snapping of the angle first. That was pretty simple. We just made it so that when you jump from one side of the plane to the other, it just takes a little bit of time for the plane to get to where it's going to tilt to. It's a really simple thing. It's subtle, but everything feels a little bit smoother. And the second thing, we made it so that when you jump on the plane, it dips a little bit in the air, like whoop, so that it's kind of like if you jumped in a boat, you would feel the boat get a little bit lower in the water and then it would float back up, right? So here's what the plane looked like with those two changes. And again, if the video is not coming through that clearly, it might be hard to see, but see if you can see it. So what's interesting about that dipping effect, I know it's subtle, but you can really feel it when you're playing the game. And when we were making it and we put that in, we thought, oh, okay, we're onto something here. Because suddenly this whole scene feels more dangerous. It feels like you're actually on this wobbly machine that's like barely staying up in the air and that you're up in the sky, like trying to hold on. And this is another thing that I think is really important. Little things, little details like that don't just affect the way that the game looks, they affect the way that the game feels. And, you know, if you've played a lot of games, I'm sure that you've played some that just don't feel that fun and some that feel really fun. And they might not be that different on paper. They might have very similar designs. But one game really got the details right and the other one didn't. So the details can really make the game. And speaking of details, one last quick thing. You see the little guy flying the plane in this video. His name is Canteen Hughes because he's a canteen that you drink out of. And we wanted it to feel like Canteen Hughes was this real little guy who was helping you out by flying the plane. He's supposed to be your friend, Canteen Hughes. So the animators drew a bunch of frames of Canteen Hughes reacting to things that could happen in the fight. And the programmers made the game play those frames at the right times. So when you play the fight, Canteen Hughes looks at where the boss is on the screen. He'll like glance up from flying the plane. If you get hit, he yells and waves his hands. And if you get to the next part of the boss fight, he applauds. So I'm going to show you that. There's he's clapping for you. So hopefully as the player, you're like, I'm in this with my buddy here and he's rooting for me, you know? Okay. So let me recap here. First, we made a simple platform that moves back and forth depending on where you stand on it. Second, we added one frame, one drawing of a plane to make sure that it would look good on the screen. Third, we added some parallax to the plane to make it look a little more three-dimensional. Fourth, we added a looping boil of animation to make it look more alive. Fifth, we added a little dip when you jump on the plane to make it feel like it's actually in the air. And sixth, we added different reactions for the pilot, Canteen Hughes. And all of this was for one object in this game. You know, there are hundreds of objects in Cuphead, and some of them were way less complex than the plane here, right? But some of them were way more complex. And if you want to make great games, it really helps to not just pay attention to this kind of detail, but to really love this kind of detail. Because we do things like this because we think it's cool. And when you're making a game, you're not just checking things off a list. You're thinking all the time, how can I make this better? Wouldn't it be cool if we did this? What if we tried this? And when you're playing a game or you're thinking about the games that you love, think about the details that make them great. You might say, oh, this game is great because it has cool weapons, but what makes those weapons feel good? The details can really be the difference between bad games and good games, or really bad anything and good anything. So I'm pretty much done, but I'm just going to show you quickly what the level looks like in the finished game. And you can check out the finished plane and check out everything else that went into this level. Okay, I'm going to pause it there before I spoil the whole thing, but a lot of crazy stuff in this level and in this game. But that's the story of the plane from the Cuphead DLC, and just some thoughts about how you polish stuff up. And that's about it. Thank you guys so much for having me.